Good evening, everyone. I'll just give it another couple of minutes for any stragglers to join us. But for those of you who are already here, welcome to tonight's webinar. I'm Jane Buchan, the Marketing Manager for Baileys Horse Feeds, and really excited to share with you tonight. Our collaboration, which came about really because we obviously forage is a big part of what we do. It's a big part of the horse's diet, so it has a huge influence on the recommendations that we're making and on the feeds that we're formulating. So it was really fascinating to get to know Sian from Hoof and Habitat and learn how she works with horse owners and landowners to find ways for them to work with their pastures and their forages to help improve things for the environment and for the horses. And Emma, my colleague, is senior nutritionist at Baileys, very knowledgeable, works with a wide variety of horse owners, recommending feeding programs as well as delivering webinars like we're having tonight and lots of other learning opportunities. So um, I think you'll find it a really interesting evening. We're going to start with Sian from Hoof and Habitat, and then we'll go in to look at the Bailey's nutrition side of things. If you have any questions as we go along, if I can ask you to put them in the Q&A, that would be brilliant. And I will monitor those. If it feels appropriate, we'll try and address them as we go along. If not, we'll save them to the end. But please be assured that we will answer all the questions. If you have to go, there will be a recording, so you can always catch up and see what we discussed at a later date. So, Sian, over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Um, so today I'm going to talk about nature's menu. Um, and to start with, we're going to look at what nature intended its menu to be and what our horses were supposed to begin to eat. So horses would have moved across various types of terrain in order to do the act of foraging or to forage. And their diet would have changed regularly, but slowly as the seasons changed and as they moved across the land. And the diet was also very diverse and full of different types of fibre. In the image on this slide, you can see ecological succession. So we start with bare rock on the left, and the longer land is exposed and can develop and evolve, it eventually moves over to forestry unless anything stops it. So our horses have typically evolved to live in grasslands and on the edge of scrub forestry ecosystems. So they would be living in this grasses and perennial stage, and that's where they'd spend the majority of their time foraging. So not just on grasses, but also on lots of other types of plants. And then they'd also have access to those shrubs and trees, and they're going to provide forage, but also shade, shelter, and a good place to scratch and to loaf, so to hang out. So grasslands in nature typically contain 20 to 60% non-grass species. And there would also be various water sources available. So whether that's a shallow pond, a river, the ocean, depending on where they are, they will have access to various natural water sources. And typically, those water sources would be much higher in mineral content than would be, for example, our tap water and the water that most of us get off of mains. So like I said, they would have had seasonal variety and they would have been encouraged to move by the environment. So typically horses would have what we call a home range, which is the area in which they'll repeatedly move across within a year in order to meet their diet requirements. And in affluent productive areas, horses could typically roam 25 kilometres squared per year, whereas in less affluent productive areas, so places like deserts, for example, they could roam up to 300 kilometres squared per year. And as the environment or the weather changes, as we get differences between seasons and across years, horses can change how far they roam in order to meet their balanced diet and their energy requirements. So they would have looked for grasses for energy, fibre, and protein. And those grasses might spike in sugar and starch under some conditions in nature, but typically not as much as we see domestically, because it's not managed in the same way. Legumes would be present, so these are nitrogen fixing plants. They're often wildflowers, but not always. They're very high in energy and protein, but they're relatively less risk of sugar and starch spikes. There would be things like flowers and herbs that providing a range of vitamins and minerals, but also a range of root types, and that's really important for the soil and for the resilience of the environment. One thing we often don't think about is sedges, rushes, and reeds, but in water, around water sources, there'll often be water-loving plants, and these are typically high in fibre, water, and also sometimes minerals, depending on how many minerals are in the water. So these are really great, particularly for good doers, because there's not a lot in it other than fibre, and it can provide a lot of bulk. But also in drought conditions, often horses in the kind of more feral wild environments will seek out plants that more often live in these water-rich environments, and they will graze them when there is drought. So shrubs and bushes are also really high in fibre. They provide minerals and trace minerals. And then also our trees are providing our fibre minerals and typically trace minerals, because the trees and the bushes typically have much deeper roots, and they're going much deeper into the soil layers to pull up those minerals. So altogether, this variety provides a range of fibre types. It encourages our horses to forage because they're actually picking between blades and between plants in their environment. That foraging encourages them to move, and they're able to get balanced diet through the variety, and enough food, presuming that they have enough ground to roam and forage on. And I just want to point out the bottom right-hand picture on this slide, because on the previous slide I mentioned ecological succession, and horses' role in ecology, in the evolution of land, is to maintain grasslands. So herbivores like horses and ponies would graze grasslands, and they would graze on the shrub to keep it at bay. So they would be actively stopping grasslands from moving into shrubland and further on into forestry. So if we don't graze grasslands, then we don't have enough grazing pressure on grasslands, and we can end up with more scrubland type environment, like we can see here on the bottom right hand image. So one of the things I want to get across today is that nature's menu, so the forage that's available to your horse in its field and in its environment, is massively impacted by the soil. So the soil itself cycles and stores nutrients. It can store water, and ultimately it provides the habitat for the food that your horse eats. So if the habitat is not optimal, then the food that's growing might not grow, or might grow but not be as productive as it could be, or not be as nutritious as it could be. And so the forage is really shaped by the soil health, as well as the plant diversity that's living within the soil, our climate, the weather, and then also our management and how we impact the land over time. And I probably don't need to tell you that most of our domestic pastures don't any longer provide the menu that nature intended for our horses, or that our horses evolved to live on. So the menu that is on offer to our horses is impacted by a lot of different things, including land use and management. Now, there are so many topics that we could cover, and we could do multiple webinars on them, but some examples that can impact the land's resilience and able to produce forage could be overgrazing, which can cause compaction of soil and stressed grass or stressed sward. So sward is um, basically the grass, but when it's got lots of different plants in it and not just grass. Use of fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides can also impact the health of the soil and the forage that grows. Fertilizers often encourage grass dominance and sugar spikes. They can also negatively impact the soil microbiome, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then another thing that we see is diversity. So not managing for high diversity or allowing low diversity to creep in is going to change the availability of nutrients to your horse and also the function and the resilience of the land. So it's worth remembering that these things all affect our pasture's ability to adapt or not adapt to extreme weather and climate. And that's something that's really important more and more as we face hay shortages from drought. But the good news is that we can manage our pastures and our hay meadows better to make them more resilient to climate change, more resilient to extreme weather, and more productive for us. So actually, in the long run, we might even not have to rely on hay so much. So we are facing a linked crisis, a crisis in the equestrian community and a crisis with our soil and our land. So horses are typically getting too much energy, too many sugars and starches, while at the same time not getting enough fibre, vitamins and minerals, or secondary plant compounds. So these are known as phytochemicals. And this can lead to a range of different issues, from obesity, EMS and laminitis, through to things like ulcers, allergies, skin conditions and more. And alongside this, our pastures are stressed. There's limited diversity. The grass or the hay yield isn't sustainable unless we buy in more. And even when we buy in more, sometimes that supply chain isn't sustainable either. For example, last year with the drought. And the soil in general is no longer functioning the way it should. And this is largely one of the main reasons is because its soil's microbiome and the soil's biology, the living workforce that I'll talk about in a minute, isn't balanced and isn't healthy. So you might have heard about microbiomes before. Microbiomes are basically all of the organisms that you can only see with a microscope. So bacteria, fungi, viruses, and so on. So humans have a gut microbiome, horses have a gut microbiome, the soil has a microbiome. So all of the viruses, bacteria, and so on that live in that area. And what we often forget is that the soil's microbiome influences the horse's microbiome through things like contact, so when they roll in it, but also through things like ingestion. So when they're eating forage, particularly when they're grazing so close to the soil, they're going to be ingesting much more of the microbiome, and also those parasites that we can't see unless we look at a microscope are also part of that. So the worm burden that the horses would be getting through the soil. So it's really important to realise that the soil microbiome and its health does impact the horse's microbiome through contact and ingestion. But also, if you don't know, the horse's microbiome is linked to metabolic, immune and digestive conditions. But it's also linked to your horse's behaviour, their ability to learn and to be trained. And this is being proven with science. So we know that we need to support the microbiome of the horse and the soil. And if we do one but not the other, then we'll find that our efforts will somewhat go backwards because the soil will be undoing what we're doing with the horses. So if we're supporting the horse's microbiome but not the soil could effectively be undoing some of the work we're doing with the horses. So like I said, our soil has lost most of its natural function. And its function actually relies on the living workforce. So that living workforce could be anything from the moles and earthworms, plant roots, all the way through to our mites, nematodes, so worms, bacteria, fungus, and so on. These guys, this living workforce is responsible for doing the work of nutrient cycling, storing water and retaining water, storing nutrients, aerating the soil, so making sure there's enough air pockets and space to get oxygen through, and really the overall health of the habitat. So the living habitat of the soil is relying on its residents to keep it functioning. So if those residents are harmed, or they're not very well, or they're removed, then the function of the soil declines. Um, and that affects everything above it, including what is available for our horses to eat and how well that grows and with what nutritional levels. So one thing to be aware of is that the more diverse the sward is on the surface, typically, the more diversity and balance there is within the soil and vice versa. So the more the more diversity we have below the soil and the more active life in the soil, the more active and diverse the forage and the sward is likely to be. So helping land helps our horses. I don't know if you've heard of the 5 domains of animal welfare. The 5 domains of animal welfare underpin basically the animal welfare legislation within the UK and other countries. And the framework basically says that all animals should have a species appropriate environment. They should receive species appropriate nutrition. They should have the ability to exhibit their natural behaviours. And then as a consequence, they should be physically healthy and have a positive mental state. So with our horses, having an appropriate environment that is healthy is something that is non-negotiable, because the environment underpins the 5 domains of animal welfare for the horse. Without a healthy environment, without the forage coming through, the nutrition cannot meet the horse's needs. And without space, movement, the herd, then the horses can't exhibit their natural behaviours. And if we lose the combination of a good nutrition with the ability to do the natural behaviours, we ultimately lose the physical health through, for example, lack of movement, and also the positive mental state. For example, if the horses can't interact with other horses, they can't move about, they can't eat what they want to eat, they don't have any choice or agency over their life, that can really impact their mental state. So the way we manage land shapes the lives of our horses and the lives that they can live, and the forage, the nutrition that's on offer. And the way we manage our land is also going to impact how resilient it is to environmental pressures like climate change and extreme weather. And then when we have a functional, regardless of what type of environment we have, but our feeding decisions can sit on top of that system and not outside of it. So the more functioning the environment, the less we need to support nutritionally. The least functioning, then the more we might need to support. So it's worth thinking about what is in your sward, or what is in your horse's forage, and what you do and don't need to supplement. So as I've mentioned, the environment underpins horse welfare, and diversity of the environment encourages movement. So if horses have to forage and are foraging through different plants, they're going to move more than if they just went into a field full of grass, because they don't need to move. It's the same thing on offer. Whereas in a diverse environment, they're going to move to find what they want and look for what they want. And in this picture, you can actually see, so this is a picture I took last year during the summer drought, and these horses spent quite a lot of time in the duck pond eating sedges, rushes and reeds. They reduced the reeds to looking like leeks sticking out the pond, and they were also picking up silverweed from the side of the banks. That's what you can see the piebald doing. And so this was their way of dealing with the drought. As you can see, they're not skinny by any measure, and they weren't giving any hay. And they were also able to go into that water to cool themselves down when they wanted to. So nutrition is one domain and one reason we want to manage our land well, but it's not a whole picture. The environment is going to influence behaviour, the horse's ability to choose and to make itself comfortable, and ultimately its health. So without a good environment, without the right kind of environment, our horse's welfare is always going to be limited. The good news is that we can look to do things to restore nature's menu and to restore the environments that our horses are living in. Now, before we look at how to do that and some of the different things we can think about, I just want to point out that obviously domestic horses aren't wild or feral horses. So they don't typically learn anymore from the landscape or the herd. So in a domestic environment compared to a wild environment, our horses are typically weaned between 6 and 9 months, as opposed to at 1 to 2 years. Our horses are typically kept with other yearlings, which is bonkers to me because it'd be a bit like me sending my son off to nursery with no adult supervision and expecting him to learn how to share with his peers without anyone to model that behaviour to him. But that's what we do. We often put youngsters together without adults to learn from. And we also often move them between environments so that even if they do have an adult to learn from and they do learn how to forage and the different types of plants and where to find them in their environment, if we then move them, then that land has changed and that generational knowledge that they've learned from their herd is no longer relevant, particularly when we start moving horses across countries into completely different climates where completely different species grow. So we're very much reliant on our horses' ability to taste and smell in order to work out what is good and bad to eat. So within a domestic system, we do need to think about safety, and we do need to have that little bit more care in terms of how we're managing compared to a wild or feral horse that might be a bit more educated on what not to eat. Another thing we need to think about is altered feeding patterns. So particularly, for example, if we have a horse that was laminitic in the past and had a very restricted diet, we might find that when that horse's diet or pony's diet is no longer restricted, that they might gorge. So we do need to think about that loss of regulation that might have happened from a previous event and might have changed their behaviour going forward, either short term or long term. So ultimately, what I'm saying is we can't assume that the horses are going to self-regulate. We can't assume that the environment's going to regulate them. And we also need to remember that our horses behave differently in domestic settings. So, for example, we know they don't cover 25 kilometres squared in a year. And we also know that they don't typically breed as much. So they don't need that energy requirement for breeding. And so this basically just means that we have a bit more responsibility to manage the risk of over or under consumption and also to manage exposure to toxic plants. Balance of a natural environment within domestic systems includes considering domestic safety. And another thing to think about if you're somebody that competes is naturally occurring prohibitive substances, because there are some naturally occurring prohibitive substances in plants. So things like valerian, devil's claw, chamomile, willow, meadowsweet are all plants that contain substances that are not ideal if they're found in your horse's blood when you're competing under FPI rules, shall we say. So we do need to manage that as well. Now, a lot of what I've said, maybe you're feeling a bit overwhelmed right now, but the thing to remember is that change is gradual, context dependent, and small things can make a really big difference. So everyone has different land, different horses, different resources, and what works for you might not work for your neighbour. And it's worth being realistic about what you can achieve and in what time frame. And to remember that small incremental changes can make a really big difference in the long term. There was a study published in Nature, and for those who might not know, Nature is a really prestigious peer-reviewed scientific journal. And this study showed that having just 4 species instead of 1 or 2 species in pasture improved resilience across sites in both Ireland and Switzerland. Now, both sites were subjected to severities of drought and also different climatic and soil conditions. But no matter what they were subjected to, when they had the fields that had the most species richness increased in yield compared to the others, but also reduced in yield variance. So there was less difference in the yield between the different conditions. And what they found in particular was that deep tap-rooted legumes, so things like alfalfa and sainfoin, increased overall forage yield, substituted fertilizer inputs with natural nitrogen fixation, supported the mitigation adaptation to climate change, and increased the nutritive value and conversion efficiency of the forage. So it basically meant that it was more nutritious and easier for the animals to digest. So this suggests that just by adding things like herbs, legumes, and wildflowers to a grass sward, we can increase the resilience of our grazing. And that's certainly what I see in practice. So it's worth remembering that we're not aiming for the land to be pretty or perfect. We're aiming for a more resilient, a more functional system that is going to support you, is going to make you less stressed, it's going to hopefully reduce your reliance on hay and also improve your horse's welfare. And ultimately, improving pasture is going to also save you money. So in this image on the right, you can see the 4 domains outside of the environment and all of the ways that you can potentially save money on those different domains, but also what we can do for the environment and how we can help, for example, with protecting our local village from flooding. If we've got 40 acres of land that can improve water storage, then we could actually think, potentially protect the local village. If we're at the top of the hill and they're at the bottom, and our soil can absorb that water, then maybe there's less water flooding in the local village. So, we can have a massive impact on our environment, particularly collectively as equestrians. So let's think about some of the practical things that we can do to support the environment, the forage, and the resilience of our pasture. Well, one thing we can think about is that fertilizers don't feed the workforce. Fertilizers feed the plants, and they feed the plants with very specific nutrients. So in contrast, organic matter is food for the soil's living workforce. It's food for the ecosystem. And so without it, the ecosystem, the habitat of the soil is going to struggle and its function starts to decline. So removing things like poo, dead plants, dead animals, all can starve the workforce. And like I said, the shop bought fertilizers, they don't feed the soil's workforce. They only provide very specific nutrients to plants. They can also end up locking up plant nutrients if there's too much of one nutrient over another. And these fertilizers just don't replenish the variety of nutrients that come out of the pasture when we remove organic matter. So the first thing we can think about is restoring balance. So if we're switching from fertilizer to organic matter, we need to be thinking about how to balance this ecosystem of energy and of organic matter. So when we add food or forage in that's been sourced from off of our land, so off-site, we're adding additional energy, we're adding fertility to the system, and we risk having too high fertility. Most people don't think about it, but we can have too high fertility as much as we can have too low fertility. And equally, when we remove everything and we never replace it, we can end up with not enough energy in the system and risk having low fertility that is too low. So we need to ensure that when we add or remove organic matter, we're trying to balance the system. So whatever we add, we need to take away. But if we take away anything that we haven't added, we need to put it back into the ecosystem at some point to feed the living workforce and to support the ecosystem and the soil. So like I said, organic matter feeds the whole system, not just the plants. And it's worth also then remembering that when we have the grasses, legumes, flowers and herbs, trees, bushes and so on, we then in connection with a healthier soil and the energy and the organic matter, we've got plants that can cope with drought, we've got plants that can cope with heavy rainfall, we've got plants that can grow at different times of the year, and all of this can reduce our reliance on hay when the weather and the climate isn't necessarily doing what we want it to. So another easy thing we can think about is supporting water retention. Now, if you're on really clay soil and it gets really wet in winter, you might be thinking, I don't want any more water. But actually, we do want the water. We just want to store it in a way that it's helpful. So we want the water to soak up, we want the soil to soak up water like a sponge in the winter and then or during heavy rainfall, and then release it slowly back to the plants in the summer. And this way, if there's a lack of rainfall, there's resilience in our grazing because there is moisture in the soil. So fertilizers don't help us support the soil in holding heavy rainfall or water storage. And compaction and overgrazing don't either. So the three ways to improve water retention is to improve your soil's structure and texture, to increase the organic matter content, and to deepen the rooting depth. So an easy way to deepen the rooting depth is to add types of plants that have deeper roots than our typical grasses. But another way is to overgraze less so that the roots are longer in the ground, and that can help, particularly over winter, with the soil's ability to get water and to store it. So another thing I want to talk about is rest. Because even when we have a resilient system and a resilient pasture, it will need rest at some point, and not all of us have acres of land to rotate grazing. Now, if your land has been damaged, it might also need to recover. If your land is really healthy, then it won't need as much rest. But even if your land is super, super healthy, there are going to be times when you need to rest. So we actually wrote an article, well, I wrote an article on this that's actually out in May's, so now, issue of Your Horse magazine called Give the Grass a Break. And that will go through lots of different ways of resting land whilst not compromising horse welfare. We've also got a blog article on it on our website. But essentially what we're trying to do is make sure we give our horses choice and agency to choose whether to be outside or inside and to interact with others or not. We're trying to enable movement, and we're trying to support that foraging behaviour. So the movement and exploration to find different types of food, regardless of where we put them, whether it's on a sward, out in a field, or in a loafing barn, or even a modified stable. So the top right hand corner, you can see a modified stable. So these horses do have a stable, but they also have the choice to come outside. And there's deliberately no pictures of traditional stables on here because they just can't support the 5 domains of animal welfare. Whereas even just modifying stables so that there's a little outdoor area encourages more movement and allows the horses to interact better. Now, this is probably one of the most expensive things that most people have to think about is finding a way to rest land and somewhere to put their horses to go. But it's really important to be able to rest land strategically rather than panic about recovering land later. So the more we can use this kind of tool, the more we can be proactive with our land and less reactive. And we can use hay as a tool whilst we're being proactive rather than panicking and having to buy in hay when we've run out of forage in our fields. So we're being proactive and we're less stressed because we're not reacting and firefighting to the fact that it's not rained and not enough's grown in our fields. And then also as we get wetter winters, having somewhere for horses to go is getting more important. Land struggles really quickly when it's saturated with water. So assuming that you've got healthy soil and the water is soaking deep into the soil, it still takes a little bit of time to do that. So you might want to remove your horses for a few hours during heavy rainfall and an hour or two after that heavy rainfall to wait for the water to seep into the soil and then put the horses back out again. Much less likely to get things like poaching by doing that. And then another thing to think about is that these rest areas can also double up as dry lots for overweight EMS lambing type ponies and horses in such a way that doesn't compromise their welfare by keeping them restricted in the stable and not able to interact with others. So another big topic that we can talk about in how to improve our environment is seed. I do have a pre-recorded webinar on this on our website because it's a very big topic to cover, but the short story is your soil has a seed bank that's going to contribute to diversity. If the conditions for the soil are right, then those seeds will germinate. The real question then becomes, well, firstly, is your soil condition right? But then secondly, what is in your soil's seed bank? If it's likely to be a load of toxic things that you don't want growing in your horse pasture, then yes, you may well want to overseed. If it's likely actually to be a load of great diverse wildflower flowers, then you may not need to overseed. One thing I will also say is that do be aware of what finding a general purpose horse safe mix. Now, there's no such thing as marketing a safe seed mix because the plants are going to respond to the management. So um, when I say horse safe, what I'm really saying is species that aren't toxic inherently, and species that aren't going to, if you're competing, aren't going to cause you to run foul of the FEI anti-doping rules. And then the last thing to be aware of is that natural grasslands are 20 to 60% non-grass species. So I'd always recommend not overseeding with anything less than 20% non-grass species. Now, wildflowers are typically more expensive than grasses because they're not agriculturally grown and harvested in the same way. But hopefully you will already seen the benefits of doing this. My cat is poking me in the face. And yeah, so when you overseed, even if you've got a mix that's 20% wildflowers and herbs, when you overseed that, obviously it's going into a grass dominant sward. So it's going to end up being less than 20% anyway. So you can overseed more and more diversity over time. So like I said at the very beginning, when we started talking about improving the environment, small changes have system-wide effects, and these small changes we make incremental improvements and have a big difference over time. So you don't need to change everything at once, and small things can influence multiple outcomes. So in this picture, you can see a predominantly grass sward. A tractor has gone through it and created tire tracks in the soil. And that soil's exposed. So the owner, my client, has come in and they've put some species-rich hay over the bare soil. And so what that's doing is it's stopping the soil from being exposed, so it's insulating against the environment. It's protecting water from evaporating off the surface. It's making sure there's ground cover for the habitat for all the organisms and the creepy crawlies that need to cross the soil. And it's also, obviously it's organic matter, so it's going to rot in and feed the soil, but it's also wildflower, well, it's species rich meadow hay with various wildflowers in it. So the seed that's in this hay is going to drop. And so she may not need to overseed this later. She might do, but when it's rotted in and the seeds germinate, she might well find that there is no need to overseed. One thing to say when you are mulching with hay is just be mindful of what hay you have, because if you do have ryegrass timothy dominated hay, then that's likely what's going to end up growing in your pastures. Timothy is typically more palatable to horses when it's dried, so it's great for hay but not so great for our fresh forage. And ryegrass, only certain strains of ryegrass do spike sugar and starches quite easily into the wrong conditions, so we do need to be careful with our good doers on that. The other thing you can see in this picture is this client of mine has got a grant to plant some trees. So she's got some trees being planted at the back, and that's going to grow into forage, shade and shelter for her horses. That's a much bigger project. So if you do want to go into kind of bigger changes for your system, you can do that kind of thing as well. And there's lots of grants and education available to do that. But like I said, you can also do the small things like covering up your bare soil to make a big difference. And as I've said before, the goal is to increase the function of your land, to increase its resilience, and increase the forage so you're less dependent on hay and nutritional support. But it's not perfection. We don't have to be perfect, and nothing has to look perfect. So you've probably already gathered by now, hopefully, that your environment and the environment's health matters to your horse. So the 5 domains of welfare are underpinned for the horse by their environment. And their nutrition is actually only one domain of their welfare, an important domain, but still only one domain. Now, natural behaviours need the horse to be able to have agency, choice, diversity, movement, and a herd. So this is what we're trying to set the pasture up to be able to do, to be resilient, to be functional, but also to be able to provide all of those things that a horse needs to exhibit its natural behaviours. So when we have our pasture set up, when we have our environment set up, we can then make feeding support decisions on top of that, and on top of that baseline that we're working with. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to the lovely Emma to talk to us a bit more about supporting our horses' nutrition based on the forage that they're consuming.
That's great. Thanks so much, Sean. I'm just going to share my screen so I have my notes. So hopefully that's come up okay. Wonderful. Let's move those over there. Fantastic. So yeah, thanks so much. That's really, really interesting, and I find it so fascinating, Sean. So thanks so much for that. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about how we can support our horses from a nutritional point of view. So we often find that what pasture and forage brings to our horses' diet is often forgotten or not even considered when people are choosing the right bucket feed for their horses. And as Sean has highlighted, most of our pastures no longer provide the menu that nature intended or that our horses evolved to live on. So modern pasture and equine management practices see it often sort of oversupplying some nutrients or maybe even undersupplying others. So with over 20 years of forage and pasture analysis to draw on, I'm going to look at the effect of forage quality on the horse and how the diet can be adjusted accordingly in our current circumstances. But of course, as your pasture is restored and it improves, then this may need to be adjusted further down the line. So forage, as we know, is the main feedstuff, or should be the main feedstuff that our horses have evolved to eat. However, it's not a consistent source of nutrients, and as Sean has already said, it's not a fixed output. So pasture will vary in nutrient content according to time of year, environmental conditions, as well as sward type. And these sort of fluctuations, along with sort of harvest times, will also affect the quality of any hay or haylage that's produced from these pastures as well. Spring pasture or hay or haylage that's been cut earlier on in the season will generally be lower in indigestible fibre and higher in both energy and protein. But these decline as pasture matures. So we can see this in our next slide. So as nutritionists, we analyse a lot of forage, so we can see what the forage portion of the diet is providing our horses. And between the years of 2007 and 2021, we collated 830 hay samples, 948 haylage samples, and 435 grass samples. So this graph shows the average crude protein content for grass for each month between April and October. And we can see clearly that the average protein in grass was highest in the spring when the grass is growing, and then it declines as the grass matures, coming into summer with a low at around July. So a late flurry of grass growth in the autumn can see average protein levels rise slightly again, and typically these would be expected to then decline over the winter months before rising again in the spring. So unsurprisingly, when grass is compared to both hay and haylage, grass had a higher average crude protein content, which we would typically expect. This can be why it can be more difficult to develop and maintain muscle condition over the winter months when grazing is poorer or limited, or for those horses that are stabled more or maybe have, less grazing available to them. Haylage had a marginally higher average crude protein content at sort of 8.68% compared to hay, which was 7.11. But there's not a huge difference between hay and haylage, and this highlights that individual harvests of both hay and haylage will vary. So haylage will not always be higher in protein than hay. It's also important to consider the individual forage quality as well as maturity. So whether that forage is soft and leafy or whether it's coarse and stalky, because this will also affect the digestibility of the forage and therefore the availability of the protein within the plant. So what crude protein doesn't tell us is the quality of the protein or the amino acid profile of sort of a particular plant or ingredient. And protein is made up of chains of amino acids, and they are either non-essential, which are produced by the horse, or they are essential amino acids, which cannot be produced by the horse and must therefore be supplied by the diet. So horses do not absorb intact proteins from their diets. So instead, proteins within forage, within grasses, within your bucket feed, are broken down by enzymes in the small intestine. And these individual amino acids or small peptides, which are short chains of 2 to 3 amino acids, are then subsequently absorbed into the bloodstream. These are then used by the cells of the body to make the proteins that our horses need at different times. So proteins can only be made if all the necessary amino acids are available to them. So whilst sort of proteins supplied by grass will fluctuate through the year, as we've just seen in one of the previous slides, it's also lower in the essential amino acid lysine. So lysine is known as the first limiting amino acid, and this basically means that whilst the diet maybe can be abundant and providing sort of high levels of crude protein, the horse can still be protein deficient if there isn't insufficient lysine for protein synthesis to occur. So this does put more emphasis on the bucket feed to ensure that these essential amino acids such as lysine are provided. So whether that is supplementing with an appropriate balancer or supplement, or even a suitable protein source such as alfalfa, for example. A forage can influence how well a forage is digested and how well its nutrients are utilised. So if you've had your forage analysed, then you may have received a report telling you the ADF and NDF levels of the sample submitted. So these are basically laboratory methods of testing the fibre content of the grass or the forage. So your ADF, which is your acid detergent fibre, measures the crude fibre and the soluble lignin portions of the plant structure. Your NDF, on the other hand, so your neutral detergent fibre, looks at the hemicellulose, cellulose and lignin content. And these are all structural components of the plant cell walls. Your ADF and your NDF are good measures of plant digestibility and also maturity. So a higher ADF and NDF value indicates that the plant is more mature. And as grass matures, the lignin concentration increases because it gives the plant more strength, and it also gives it sort of more rigidity. So lignin is unfortunately completely indigestible for the horse, whereas hemicellulose and cellulose need to be broken down by the microbial populations that Sian mentioned earlier in the hindgut. So a higher NDF indicates that the plant's got sort of a thickened layer of hemicellulose, cellulose, and this lignin around sort of the plant cell walls. And this can prevent the fermentation process in the hindgut from breaking down the forages effectively, and therefore it can affect the nutrients available to the horse. So forages that are higher in this sort of indigestible fibre are generally coarser, they contain more stalk and stem, they're less leafy, and they can be less palatable to some horses. So when you're looking at sort of hay or haylage, they tend to be generally harvested sort of much later on in the season, maybe a second cut, for example. Forages with a lower fibre level may appear to be much softer, much higher in leaf content, and they typically have been harvested earlier on in the system when the plants are younger. And this is when we're considering again sort of your hays and haylages. There is not much of a difference in the average fibre levels between hay and haylage, as you can see in this chart. However, fibre levels tended to be lower in grass than hay or haylage, indicating that grass will be more digestible, which again is not surprising. So typically, grass samples that we analysed were usually taken during sort of the vegetative or growth stages, so between sort of that April, sort of October time. And grass will also be continuously growing as it's grazed, and therefore it may not have moved sort of into those later growth phases, which may also sort of give us one of the reasons why we find that the fibre levels are lower when we're analysing our grass in comparison to your hay and haylage. So let's have a little look at how grass changes again over the months. So again, this graph shows the average ADF or fibre content from April to October. And it tends to be fairly low in April when the grass is in its sort of early growth stages, and it rises steadily as the grass matures through into the summer months. So at this stage, it tends to remain relatively high, which is to be, again, expected. So we can see how this changes as grass matures and why early sort of early cut or later cut hays and haylages also will have different sort of fibre levels. We also see a similar pattern when we're looking at the NDF levels within grass as well. So for the months that we don't show, we would expect it to stay fairly high through the winter months, possibly reduce if there is sort of an autumn flurry of growth, and then we would expect it to then drop down again once the grass has started to grow. To drop down again, and then once the grass starts to grow, coming into spring, we would expect it to sort of stay sort of at that lower level. So let's compare both the fibre and the protein level. So you can see here the relationship between the fibre and protein content of pasture, again, between sort of April and October. And as grass matures and becomes more fibrous, the protein content will typically reduce. So protein is typically found in the leaf of the plant. So it's not really surprising that as the plant matures and becomes more stalky, more fibrous, that the amount of protein will also decline. So this can impact the overall balance of the diet, with protein possibly falling short. You might see differences in your horse's conditions, so they might maybe lose muscle mass maybe at this time of year. You might find sort of things like their hoof, their coat, their skin quality may also be affected. And also consider breeding stock. So if you've got mares, for example, that are out grazing, that are lactating, or you've got young horses that are growing and developing, they will generally have a much higher protein requirement, and therefore we may need to support them a little bit more during that time. So what happens to the energy or the calorie content of forage as this fibre increases? Well, we know that an early cut forage with a low fibre or ADF, NDF content is typically more digestible for the horse. But are these forages also higher in calories or energy? Well, when we look at this chart, it shows 830 green dots, surprisingly, each representing a result from 830 hay samples that we analysed. And the position of the green dot corresponds with the fibre value for the sample along the sort of the bottom axis of the chart, and the digestible energy and calorie value for that sample along the top. So you can see here the little dot that we circled in red has a digestible energy value of around 7 megajoules per kilo, and the fibre value is around 36. So we can see that there is generally a downward pattern here. So as fibre increases, energy and calories decrease. So we can assume that a forage with a low fibre value will probably have a higher energy or calorie content, and a forage with a high fibre will probably have a low level of energy or calories. And you can see on the chart here that we've got some outliers. So some of the little dots are sort of not sort of following sort of that general trend. But generally speaking, they do sort of clump together, and this is the case. So if you are looking at a very soft leafy forage that you think might have a low fibre value, you can probably assume that the energy or calorie content will be high as well, and also more calorific, and also vice versa. So although this graph here is showing the pattern that we see in hay, we also see a similar pattern when we're looking at both haylage and also grass. So let's look at our average digestible energy for each forage type. Well, the average digestible energy in hay and haylage was relatively similar, as you can see here, though the DE for hay was marginally higher, not by a lot though. So with the lower sort of ADF, NDF and crude fibre levels in grass that we looked at earlier, it's unsurprising that the DE value or energy value for the grass was also higher than both hay or haylage. But despite this, there was not a huge difference. There was only a difference of 0.4 megajoules per kilo, which is not a huge amount when we're looking at sort of grass and hay. So what is perhaps more relevant is the higher levels of indigestible fibre, which we've shown in the previous slides. And for hay and haylage, sort of compared to grass, as this will impact the availability of the energy or calories to the horse, and again, how well the forage will help to sort of maintain weight and condition. It's also not unusual to hear that haylage is better to feed than hay if your horses need to put weight on. However, the results that we see here highlight that this is not actually the case, and that the energy or calorie content of hay or haylage is actually very similar. So we need to be looking at individual cuts of either hay or haylage, with really sort of looking at specific sort of detail. So it will depend on sort of the plants that are used within the harvest. It will also sort of depend on sort of environmental conditions as well. So these will all affect what we're left with. So the forage really should be considered on an individual basis when deciding which is better for weight gain, taking into maybe account the visual appearance of the forage that you've got in front of you, maybe the feel of it. Is it, coarse, stalky, or has it got lots of green leaf? Rather than whether it's just hay or whether it's haylage, because we quite often see there's not a huge difference there. So grass, especially in the spring, supplies considerably more nutrients and energy or calories than hay or haylage. Again, not surprising to most of you. And it's likely that the energy or the calorie demands from our horses will be partially, if not fully satisfied, or most likely exceeded by what each of our horses graze each day. But what about sort of hay and haylage? Well, let's have a little look here. With some levels that we've got. So the National Research Council's nutrient requirements for horses basically provides a guideline for us in the feed industry for a minimum daily intake of different nutrients, including digestible energy for all horse body weights and workloads based on the best peer-reviewed research internationally. So when we look at the NRC, it suggests that a mature 500 kilo horse in light work needs a minimum daily energy intake of 83.7 megajoules to maintain body weight. Do note that some horses may require more than this, with factors such as age, health status, temperament, voluntary movement, and also sort of temperature playing a role. So how does the energy provided from forage compare to these sort of minimum requirements? Well, when we take a horse consuming an average of 2% of his body weight in dry matter as forage per day, this equates to a 500 kilo horse consuming 10 kilos. So you can see from this chart here that all three forages, so hay, haylage and grass, exceed the basic minimum daily energy or calorie requirements for horses at rest or in light levels of work. So this highlights why forage alone with little or no hard feed can still result in excess weight gain for those horses who are, good doers that maintain their weight well. So what do we know? Well, it's likely that energy or calorie requirements are met for those horses in light work when they're consuming 2% of body weight of forage as dry matter per day. Those, however, in moderate and harder work intensities, as well as breeding stock, will have a much higher requirement for energy and forage alone. And forage alone may not sort of meet their or supply their requirements. So we may need to sort of support that. Each individual will have have varying requirements according to age, reproductive status, workload. It's not static. So assessing sort of body condition scores along with morphometric measurements is a good indication to whether the diet is supplying adequate or over or under supplying energy requirements. What will be less obvious is whether the requirements for vitamins, minerals, and also that quality protein, so those essential amino acids, are fully met through forage or grazing intake alone. So a question, so does grass, hay or haylage provide all the nutrients a horse or pony needs? I'm not going to get you to answer, but probably not. And we know this again by looking at the analysis that we do. So our analysis shows that for all ages, workloads and reproductive stages, on average, grass pasture will not provide enough copper and zinc to meet minimum NRC requirements for all types of horse. So don't forget that NRC is the minimum recommended amount, not the optimum, but the minimum. So they can very quickly go into a deficiency. When we look at hay and haylage, hay and haylage will not provide enough sulfur, copper or zinc, again, to meet minimum requirements. So copper, zinc, and sulfur were the biggest shortfalls for all types of horse. But as we move up into higher workloads and nutrient demands, the shortfalls become greater. So for moderate and harder workloads, phosphorus, magnesium, sodium levels were also not sufficient to meet minimum requirements. So these amounts are also based on the horse consuming a minimum of 2% of body weight on a dry matter basis as forage per day. So if you're feeding less forage or less forage is being consumed by your horses, then other nutrient intakes will also be lower and also may result in further shortfalls. So what? Why does that matter? Well, the importance of vitamins and minerals in the horse's diet really can't be overemphasized. So, for example, if we look at copper, it's essential for connective tissue development, skeletal growth, immune function, and iron metabolism. It supports the production of elastin and collagen, promotes strong blood vessels, maintains good hoof and coat health, aids in energy production, just to name a few. Zinc, on the other hand, is a vital component of enzymes that support immune function, skin and hoof health, metabolism. It's essential for keratin synthesis, protein production, antioxidant protection, which are crucial for maintaining, again, healthy skin, strong hooves, and efficient wound healing. So a shortfall of these key minerals, as well as quality protein, may result in our horses lacking in energy, for example, which may have an impact and sort of result in poor performance. Hoof, skin, coat quality may be poorer. They may lack muscle or top line and therefore strength, again, which has an impact on sort of their strength, their performance, and how well they're doing. Their immunity may be compromised. And all of this is going to potentially increase maybe injury or disease risk. It's really important to remember it's low levels of some of these minerals can impact on the digestibility of others, and this can result in further deficiencies. So this effect is the reason that single nutrients should not be focused on unless there is a known and quantified deficiency or excess of a certain mineral in the animal. And you can see from this picture here on the slide just how many interactions there are with all the minerals, and how important creating that balance is. It's not about one individual nutrient, it's about creating that whole balance. So poor quality forage can unbalance the diet even when you are supplementing with a bucket feed or a supplement. So how can we combat nutrient shortfalls? Well, you can feed more concentrate feed or more supplement where and when it's appropriate. If, however, you're already feeding the full recommended amount of a particular product, what you may find is actually increasing that product may oversupply maybe some of the nutrients or may oversupply some of the calories or the energy, which could encourage unnecessary weight gain or maybe exuberant behaviours. So it's not always a suitable option. You may need to possibly consider moving to a higher nutrient-based feed that provides maybe a more concentrated amount of nutrients. So for example, you might want to maybe move from something like a daily balancer to a performance balancer, and that may be sufficient to counteract the shortfalls within the forage that we have. You can also look at topping up the existing feed with a balancer or again a supplement to support again vitamin and mineral, maybe protein requirements, or if it's just protein that we're needing to sort of improve upon, and we're meeting vitamin and mineral requirements, then again quality sort of protein sources or fiber sources such as an alfalfa can be a really great way of boosting sort of quality protein in the diet without actually affecting sort of the vitamin and mineral content. So what feed? And as we know, there are, a myriad of different feeds, and when we go out and we go to our feed merchants and stockists. So compound feeds are designed to be fed at a rate to meet our horse's requirements for his body weight, but also his work intensity. They will supply varying amounts of energy or calories as well as nutrients according to workload and body condition. But if you don't feed them at the recommended amount for body weight or workload, it will and can result in your diet being unbalanced. So these products are designed and formulated to be fed alongside average quality forage. So if you're not feeding sort of the right levels or your forage is of poorer quality, then your diet can become unbalanced quite quickly, which can result maybe in potential weight loss, poor energy levels, lack of stamina or that bounce back, maybe after a competition or hard training session. Lack of muscle development, again, poor coat, poor hooves, or again, just simply increasing that risk of injury, which we obviously don't want. So what bucket feed is the best option for your horse? So before you can decide on the most suitable product, you really need to consider whether it's suitable for your workload. Products will be designed specifically for a specific workload. So they should tell you whether it's for light work or rest, whether it's for a horse at moderate or harder levels of work. And that's really important because they will provide more nutrients to support harder levels of work or fewer nutrients if your horses are not doing quite so much. Choose a product that's suitable for body weight and condition. If you've got a horse that holds its weight very well, you will need to be looking and choosing products that provide fewer calories than maybe that horse that struggles to keep the weight on. Does it provide the right type of sort of an amount of energy for your horse? So if your horse is very exuberant and very excitable, you may want to, not go down sort of a higher cereal based sort of route, but actually looking towards sort of maybe a high oil, high fiber sort of based option. Are there sufficient nutrients to counteract possible shortfalls within the forage? And you might need a little bit of help here, maybe from a nutritionist or somebody that that you're buying their products from to see whether that is the case, particularly if you've had sort of an analysis done with your forage. You might also need to consider clinical considerations. So if your horse is sort of metabolic, laminitic, EMS, for example, then again, you will need to look at specific rations that are low starch, low sugar, and therefore suitable for that particular animal. Has your horse got the appetite? These products are designed to be fed at a certain level. So if your horse has got a limited appetite and doesn't like or eat a huge volume, then products that are fed in larger amounts may not be a great option for him because he may not be actually able to eat the relevant nutrients or energy that he needs. So you might need something that's maybe more concentrated. Is it palatable for them? There's no point feeding something that's, wonderful that your horse won't eat. And can you feed the volume that you need to feed of that product in the correct number of feeds? So remember that, we need to be feeding little and often. And actually, if you can only sort of go up to the yard, you're only feeding once a day and you need to feed a product at say 4 to 5 kilos in order to meet requirements, that horse simply will not be able to digest that volume in one bucket feed. So you'll have to either rethink your management or rethink what you're feeding. And don't overcomplicate it. Feeding should not be complicated. You should look at your forage first and then you want to sort of build up from that. So whether it's a supplement, whether it's a balancer, or whether you need something with a higher energy or calorie content, but you shouldn't have bags and supplements all over the place. 2 or 3 should usually be adequate for you. If your current grazing solution is supplying limited or poor grazing, then additional fibre sources are likely to be needed until it improves. And hopefully with Sian's help, you'll be able to do that now. So some horses can also be anxious when they're out in paddocks and they can pace a lot or they're too busy having fun with their friends and they may not maybe be eating as much grass as we would like. So in these cases, you may need to offer alternative forage sources. So you need to ensure that your horse has sufficient fibre and is not standing around, ideally for more than 4 hours at any time. Prolonged amounts of time without sufficient forage will increase the risk of conditions such as gastric ulcers. So you might need to be putting out additional forage in the fields, your paddock or your pens. So hay, haylage, for example. You might want to consider a fibre buffet, which we've got here in one of the pictures. This encourages more natural foraging behaviour and also more movement. And it also helps to supply more diversity, helping to support the animal's microbiome, which is important. Choose an option to suit calorie requirements, so straw-based chaffs or later cut grasses for those that are on maybe calorie controlled diets or small amounts of sort of unmolassed beets can be useful. Or if you need a higher calorie sort of intake, or you've got maybe an older horse that maybe struggles to chew, then things like alfalfa-based products or beet-based products fed in larger volumes are a great way of providing some good calories. If you're struggling to minimize calories, then you might need to sort of opt for sort of soaked hay. You can get slow feeders. There are lots of options that you can pop out into your paddocks these days. So these solutions can be really a useful way to support your horse's diet, at least until you can improve the grazing and offer more diversity with better land management. And on that note, both Sian and I will be available to answer any questions. So that brings us to a close. So thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sian and Emma. We do actually have 1 or 2 questions. Emma, Jane is asking, aren't the high NDF hays extremely useful for horses which are very easily overloaded with forage nutrients? She can believe that palatability is very important when selling a product, but a lower level of palatability could be very useful for a horse that tends to overeat. She finds it very difficult to source that sort of forage.
Yeah,
So yes,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, and I completely agree with that in that sense. Yes, so we would quite often, for example, recommend things like straw, for example, in addition to hay, if we're trying to sort of keep calorie intake as low as possible. What we've got to be a little bit careful of is that you are not increasing the risk of things like impaction colics and that kind of thing. So we do need to be a little bit more sort of cautious there as well. But yes, a higher NDF can be useful, and actually we do recommend that you feed forages that are harvested sort of much later on in the season if you have got a horse that's a very good doer, because it enables you to supply the fibre that you need to keep those microbes happy and healthy. So they're fermenting and sort of doing their job. But it is a fine balance as well. Sometimes forages that have got very high levels of NDF can sort of cause other issues as well. So because they're not as digestible, so it can sort of cause issues with things like fecal water, for example, can be a problem. If you've got horses that maybe struggle with things like colitis, so it is a bit of a fine balance. And if you're feeding those types of forages because you have got a horse that is a very good doer, then you will need to make sure that you are supporting potentially the nutrient shortfalls that that forage will have with the right bucket feed or supplement to make sure that things like the vitamins and the quality protein is being met.
great, thank you. Sian, there's one for you. In fact, well, yeah, I think there's quite a lot in my head, but we can, yeah, we can talk about that. I mean, I think we all kind of, well, maybe we don't, but sort of from, one understands that adding organic matter to the soil improves the quality and clearly improves the microbiome and so on. And from your slide, it kind of implied that maybe we shouldn't be picking all the poo or any poo. So obviously, then we're all very conscious of worm burdens. So how do we find a compromise? What are there other organic matters that we can put on the soil, or how can we find a sort of happy medium with what we take away as far as poo picking and what we leave for the microbiome?
That's a great topic and a great question. So the short answer is it depends on your system. So if you have the ability to rotate often and you can rest land for a sufficient amount of time, then you can potentially leave poo and spread it about with a harrow,
Yeah.
for example. But that often doesn't work for most people because they just can't leave the land long enough for the worms to break down. So we typically, the safest option in terms of time is 3 months to let manure rot before putting it back on the pasture. Now, that is sometimes lower. It depends what your horse's worm burdens are, which worms are there, what the temperature's doing, how much UV light there is to help degrade and cut through the worm cycle. The other thing is whether you've got mixed grazing. So can you, for example, put sheep on the land? But for people who are poo picking, who don't have the option to rest land for 3 months, who don't have sheep and goats and so on, then what I would typically say is remove the manure, wait for it to rot down, and then add it back on the pasture. If you've got small acreage, then you might end up always having a full wheelbarrow, so you might be leaving with fresh and returning with decomposed. But it's essentially then when you get onto the larger acreages, you might be looking at hiring or using a muck spreader, for example.
Mm.
There are multiple different types of organic matter, and as I say, diversity heals. So we don't want to be putting in all of the same organic matter all of the time. We want to make sure there's a variety. One of the easiest things we could do is be a little bit less tidy with things like hay sweepings in fields. So we don't want to smother the grass. We don't want the hay to be left so that you can't see the grass at all. But if you are putting hay out into your fields, then you can let, a couple of strands stay there and be trodden into the ground. Wood chip can be really helpful, species safe. Wood chip. So if you've got somebody coming to cut back your hedges, ask if you can have the wood chip, particularly if you know they're things like hawthorn, and you can spread that. So again, you want to spread really thinly. In general, I say less is more. You can always add more later. It's harder to take it away. So it's much better I say about dusting a cake with icing sugar, not slapping on layers of fondant and marzipan. And also, the less you put on, typically the quicker, it'll rot down and integrate back into the soil. Other things you can think of are things like leaf mulch, so leaves falling off the trees, off of the hedges. They can be great, particularly because trees and our hedges have those deeper root systems, so they're bringing up more minerals. When we top our fields, we don't always have to remove what we've topped. We can leave that in as well to rot down. And the other thing that people often don't think about is things like seaweed. So we often feed seaweed meal to our horses to get a lot of nutrients. And horses, so for example, Connemara ponies that would have roamed the Isle of Connemara will have often gone out foraged for seaweed to fulfill that mineral nutrient deficiency. And we can utilise seaweed as organic matter as well and spread that onto our pastures. We do need to be a bit careful of the salt levels, but that is something that we can look at. And when I think about levels, the other thing to be aware of with things like spreading hay is what it might have been fertilised with. So if we think back to Emma's beautiful slide about mineral interactions, that happens in the ground and in the plants as well. So the soil and its microbiome all have their interactions, and so do the plants. So for example, if the hay is high in potassium, then that could cause lockup of various other minerals in the soil. Equally, if it's really high in calcium, we can end up with magnesium deficiencies. So we do need to be aware of not oversupplying nutrient if we can help it. And certainly in terms of manure, which is the most likely way we as equestrians are going to oversupply to our pastures, assuming we're not fertilizing with sprays, is that nitrogen, so the manure nitrogen. And the easiest way to spot if you've got a bit of heavy fertilization is to look out for your nettles and your cleavers. So if things like your nettles start growing, you know that area is particularly fertile. And so you'll probably find if you look at your muck heap and it's left long enough, it just looks like a mound of nettles and cleavers. So that's sticky weed. And that's because they just love those really high fertile soils. So as soon as you see a patch of nettles growing, particularly in that area, you want to slow down with the organic matter until a little bit later. And then once the nettles have died back a bit and it's showing that it's reduced in fertility, you can add again later.
Brilliant. Thank you. I did wonder actually, because I do actually put my field muck on a heap and actually sort of everybody goes and nicks it for the garden. But yeah, maybe I'll actually have to put a fence around it and save it for the field.
Can I just make a comment just on the seaweed in that just I suppose particularly with breeding stock in particular, just be a little bit cautious of things like your iodine levels because your iodine can be quite high in seaweed. So if you're going to use that as on top of your paddocks, you probably need to get a little bit more sort of maybe expert advice. Don't just slap it on willy-nilly maybe.
Yeah, don't
So yeah.
It's often an ingredient inside feeds as well, product feeds.
It
I know a lot
is,
of
yeah,
balancers do
it
have
is.
seaweed meal inside of them.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jane.
No, that's fine. I think actually that's covered all the questions. So thank you both very much indeed. And thank you all for staying with us, and I hope you found it interesting and to excuse the pun, food for thought. I think it's certainly something now I would say that we're all going to go away and think a lot more about. And as Sian says, there are probably, when we think about it, there are some little things that most of us can do, even if we don't necessarily have full control over the land that our horses are on. But there'll be some little things that we can do that can actually make big differences to that little patch of environment, and then ultimately to our horses' welfare as well. So thank you very much. Obviously, if you want to find out more, you can see their websites and social media feeds. There's an awful lot, and we'll all be very happy to get back and answer any questions that you may have if you want to email or direct message us. So do feel free to do so. But otherwise, thank you, Emma and Sian, and thank you all, and good night.